It starts with a dream you can't quite place, a whisper of some forgotten idea, a shape in the dark that feels more real than your own hands. We've all had them. You wake up, the phantom feeling fades with the morning light, and you get on with your day. But what if one day you woke up and you weren't empty-handed? What if that impossible thing from your dream was lying right next to you, solid and real, humming with a silent promise? This is the story of a man who found an object just like that. A book that knew him better than he knew himself. A book that offered him his true purpose, and then demanded a price he never could have imagined. The first thing Alex knew was the gasp that tore from his own throat, yanking him from a dream of falling ink and rustling pages. He shot upright in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The room was dark, silent, wrapped in the usual pre-dawn gloom. Nothing was out of place. The chair in the corner with its pile of clothes. The faint orange glow from the street lamp filtering through the thin curtains. It was all so normal, except for the weight in his hands. He looked down. His fingers were locked around something heavy, solid, cold to the touch. It was a book, thick, bound in dark, cracked leather that seemed to just soak up the light in the room. There was no title on the cover, just a tangle of interlocking symbols that shifted and reformed if he looked at them for too long. He had no memory of finding it, no clue how it got into his bed, into his hands, and yet, with a terrifying, absolute certainty, he knew. It was the book from his dream. Section 1. The Impossible Discovery. He spent that first hour just staring at it, perched on the edge of his bed as the sun started to bleed into the sky. Every rational part of his mind was screaming at him. It had to be a prank. He'd brought it home drunk and forgotten about it. It was a hallucination, a symptom of the burnout from a job he hated, and a life that felt like a bad script he had to perform every single day. But the book was undeniably real. He could feel the grain of the ancient leather, smell the faint, metallic scent of the pages, like the air after a lightning strike. Finally, pulled by an urge that felt both totally alien and deeply personal, he opened it. The pages were thick, almost like parchment, filled with a script that was somehow strange and familiar all at once. As his eyes scanned the lines, the characters seemed to melt and reshape themselves into words he could understand. It was his own handwriting, not his current, hurried, jagged scrawl, but a version of it that was elegant, confident, and a complete stranger to him. The first chapter was titled The Unplayed Chord. It didn't tell a story. It was a blueprint for a single piece of music. It described a melody born from silence, a rhythm that matched a forgotten heartbeat. The words were poetic but precise, describing a cascade of notes Alex had never heard before, but which echoed in his bones like he'd known the tune his whole life. It was a beautiful, haunting piece of music. And according to this book, he wrote it. His eyes drifted to the corner of his apartment, where his father's old acoustic guitar had been collecting dust for a decade. He'd tried to learn once, but his fingers were clumsy. He had no ear for it. He'd given up, just another failed attempt at finding a passion, a purpose. Now, moving almost like he was in a trance, he walked over and picked it up. He expected the usual awkwardness, the frustrating noise of his own failure. But when his fingers touched the strings, something was different. They felt like an extension of his own body. Without even thinking, his hands started to move, and from the guitar came the music, the exact melody from the page. Note for perfect note. It was complex, sorrowful, achingly beautiful. It filled his small apartment with a sound so profound it made the air tremble. He played it flawlessly, from beginning to end, as if he'd been practicing for a lifetime. When the final note faded, Alex just sat there in stunned silence, the guitar resting in his lap. His hands were trembling, not from effort, but from the shock of it all. The book hadn't been lying. This was a piece of him he never knew existed, and this was only the first chapter. Section 2. The Obsessive Pursuit. The book became his whole world. He called in sick to his data entry job. Then he stopped calling at all. His friends' texts went unanswered. Their calls went to voicemail. His entire universe shrank to the four walls of his apartment, and the endless world inside that leather-bound book. Every chapter was a new revelation, unlocking a part of himself he never dreamed he had. He read a chapter on theoretical physics. Just hours later, he filled a notebook with equations that solved paradoxes he'd never even heard of. He'd just stare at a page, and the knowledge would flow into him, not like memorized facts, but like remembered truths. His apartment started to transform. The blank walls were soon covered in intricate charcoal drawings of faces he'd never seen. Architectural blueprints for impossible, beautiful buildings, star charts of constellations that weren't in any sky he knew. He wasn't just learning, he was remembering who he was. But as his sense of purpose grew, so did a new, unsettling feeling. It started as a flicker in the corner of his eye, a shadow that danced just at the edge of his vision. He'd turn his head, and nothing would be there. He'd be sketching, lost in concentration, and a sudden cold spot would drift through the room, making the hairs on his arms stand up before it vanished as quickly as it came. He wrote it off as exhaustion, the price of his round-the-clock obsession. Then the whispers started. They were faint, like wind through a keyhole, too quiet to be a voice, but too clear to be his imagination. He'd be reading, and a floorboard would creak in the hallway outside his bolted door. The reflection in his darkened window would sometimes show a shape standing behind him, a tall, gaunt silhouette that disappeared the moment he spun around. He found a line in the book, tucked between a guide to lost languages and a diagram of the human heart drawn with impossible detail. It read, "Every light that shines invites the dark to look. Every beacon calls out to the void. To be seen is to be known." The words sent a chill down his spine. The book was making him brilliant. It was giving him a purpose beyond his wildest dreams. But he had the terrible feeling it was also making him visible. As if his newfound genius was a lighthouse, cutting through a fog he hadn't known was there, and something ancient and hungry was now turning its gaze toward the light. Section 3, the final chapter. The creative mania and the paranoia were now inseparable. Weeks had passed in his self-imposed exile. He was thin and wired, his eyes wide with a mix of genius and pure fear. The feeling of being watched wasn't a fleeting sensation anymore. It was a constant, heavy presence. He kept the blinds drawn, but he could feel its attention pressing against the glass. The shadow was no longer a trick of the light. It was a definite shape. A tall, slender figure that he'd glimpsed for a heart-stopping second before it melted away. He was almost at the end of the book. The final pages were thinner, the script on them tighter, more urgent. He felt a desperate need to finish, a feeling that this was the final piece of the puzzle that would make him whole. The last chapter wasn't about a new skill or some hidden talent. It was about him. It was titled, "The Witness." In his own elegant handwriting, it described a lonely man in a small apartment, a man who felt like a ghost in his own life. It described his discovery of a strange book, his obsessive journey through its pages, his growing power, and his creeping dread. It was a perfect biography of the last few weeks, written by someone who had seen every single moment. It was the story of his transformation, not into a genius, but into a beacon. He read faster, his breath catching in his throat. The final paragraph described him, right now, sitting in the dim light, reading these very words, his heart pounding with terror and anticipation. And then the last sentence, just 6 words. "Now, you are finally ready to be seen." He read the last word, for a single, perfect, terrible moment. A profound sense of completion washed over him. He understood everything. He felt the sum total of his own potential, a universe of knowledge and skill settling into his mind. He was no longer Alex, the data entry clerk. He was an artist, a scientist, a musician, a creator. He was complete. Then the book in his hands began to glow. a soft, internal light at first, which quickly flared into a searing white that forced him to squint. The pages curled at the edges, turning a brittle, fiery orange before crumbling into black ash. The ancient leather cover cracked and flaked away into nothing. In less than 10 seconds, the impossible object that had reshaped his entire existence had destroyed itself, leaving nothing but a fine gray dust on his lap. A sudden, impossible draft from the sealed window swept through the room, scattering the last traces of it into the air. The book was gone. Conclusion: silence. The glow was gone. The apartment was still, but the knowledge wasn't. It remained, a supernova of talent and understanding blazing in his mind. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Alex's face. He'd done it. He had finished the book. He had found himself. He looked up from his empty hands, and the smile froze on his lips. The feeling of being watched was gone. It had been replaced by the fact of being seen. Across the room, standing where the book used to be on his shelf, was the figure. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a fleeting glimpse. It was solid, real, utterly terrifying. It was impossibly tall and thin, a column of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the light from the air around it. It had no face, no features, just a still, silent presence that was focused entirely on him. And the triumphant knowledge in his mind curdled into a single, devastating realization. The book was never a gift. It was a tool. It wasn't meant to unlock his purpose for him. It was a catalyst, a way to fatten up a soul, to polish a mind until it shone so brightly it couldn't be missed. The book's only purpose was to make him the perfect thing to be hunted, and the hunt was over.